Okay, hi everyone. So I'm going to pick up where Anna and Alex left off a little bit and looking at the dynamics of our campaign that started at the end of August and we're now, or mid-August, and we're now 3 weeks in. Election day is September 20th, and we actually have our first debate tonight, leaders debate in French language on TVA, which is a Quebec cable station that is the first debate. And then we have the debates a week from now, 8th and 9th. And I say this because I want you to remember two numbers, 35-30. For a while now, the polls in Canada have hovered around the Liberals at about 35%, led by Justin Trudeau, and the Conservatives at 30%, led by Erin O'Toole. And as Alex said, why Trudeau called this election? Well, the polls have been consistent pretty much through the pandemic. The Liberals were up towards 40% for a while. That's majority territory in the way Canadians vote. If you get around 40%, you're pretty much close to a majority government, given the way regional voting disparities shake down and the fact that we have five major parties. So he called it. And in 2.5 weeks, he saw those numbers go from 35 to 30, and now the Conservatives are leading him by about 4 to 7 points, depending on the poll, which puts them in maybe the most seats territory, but maybe not quite at a majority government yet. So we'll see what happens in the next little while. But I want to focus on what, in terms of branding and marketing, the leaders have done in this campaign a little bit. In 2015, when Justin Trudeau formed a majority government, one of the reasons he won, and this goes back to Alex's point around the rhetoric-reality gap, one of the reasons Trudeau won is that the expectations for him in that election were unbelievably low. And this is largely driven by the marketing of Justin Trudeau by the Conservative Party. I would argue that's still one of the worst attempts to brand a leader in the history of modern marketing and branding. Was the 2015 or the as soon as Trudeau took over leadership 3 years before that, the 2015 branding of Justin Trudeau made him a majority prime minister. It was so bad, and the reaction of Canadians who were not diehard Conservatives was the exact opposite thing the Conservatives wanted. People sympathized with Justin Trudeau. All he had to do was string a sentence together in the debate, and he did better than that, and he had a majority government. And in 2019, Andrew Scheer was leader of the Conservative Party. He's no longer leader. They did the same thing in the sense that they went negative on Trudeau. They never stopped going negative on Trudeau, but in terms of their marketing about what he was, they thought it would work because in the first part of the 2019 campaign, we had what was called the blackface scandal, where images of Justin Trudeau when he was a high school teacher in Vancouver came to surface. He dressed up as Aladdin. He was dressed up as Prince in high school as well. And these images came to light, and it kind of dominated the first week or two of the campaign. And he was already in trouble in terms of holding a majority at that point. But it became another campaign focused a lot on Trudeau's personality. It's personality driven, Scheer going vicious on Trudeau. And that, again, Trudeau, because of his media skills, because of his skills at managing public expectations, I think he survived that. This time around, the marketing and branding innovation, I think, is that the Conservatives did not take the bait. They have a new leader, Erin O'Toole. No one knows who he is, unless you're a Conservative. He's introducing himself to the country. And instead of going negative on Trudeau as their centerpiece, the Conservatives issued an over 100-page platform in the first week of the campaign. And so, and this was almost unexpected. It kind of caught the media off guard to a certain extent, in an election that everybody thought would be a sleeper. And I would argue that since the campaign began, it has actually been policy focused rather than leadership personality driven. O'Toole is actually staying away from talking down Trudeau as his front and center point, which I find really interesting because it's working. In an election where the government felt and the Liberal Party felt they could run on their laurels from the pandemic, they've been caught off guard. They've had to respond and come up with their platform that just came out yesterday. And it almost feels a little haphazard, like they didn't expect this. And so they're really actually now running from behind. And what's fascinating about the Canadian election is we actually don't know who's going to be the government in a couple of weeks. We're now only 18 days away from Election Day. And it really could be 4 different scenarios where we could have the Liberals climb back in the polls and have a minority government. We could have the Conservatives get the most seats and have a minority government. We could have the Conservatives with a majority government. I think the Liberal majority is probably off the table now. There's just not enough time in the campaign. Or we could have a very likely scenario in a parliamentary system this time around where the Conservatives get the most seats, but they're close to the Liberals, and Justin Trudeau still stays on as prime minister because he has a working relationship with the third party, the New Democrats, because they'd have a majority of the seats between the two of them. So you get another situation where he's propped up by a second party, maybe a more formal coalition, especially if he finishes second. So we have all these now interesting scenarios where in the first week of the campaign, it was felt a little bit like the Liberals were on autopilot. And this is where I think Trudeau's branding and marketing, which Jennifer's just written a chapter for our 2019 book about, the Trudeau image. People were getting tired of it 2019. I would argue in 2021, it's not as much a factor at all. And because Trudeau can't do the selfies, because he can't do the events the way that he did and mimic the 2015 Trudeau Mania Part 2 that he had, that is a real problem on the campaign trail. And you watch every day, especially over the last 7 or 8 days, the Liberals are trying desperately to pivot in this election. Either throw shade at O'Toole and go negative on the Conservatives, or try to get the upper hand again on the issues that matter to them. But Trudeau's been dogged by the pullout in Afghanistan, and that has dominated the media scrum around him every day. So he has had to face these issues of why wasn't Canada prepared with the Taliban taking over Kabul? Why were we sort of piggybacking on the United States? We weren't really in control of our foreign policy. So while it's not an issue that voters might care that much about unless you're, say, in the military, it dogs him, and that continues to reflect negatively on that. Add to that, Trudeau, whom, as Alex said in 2015, everybody sympathized with, everybody liked, unless you were a conservative. This time around, every event now has protesters, mostly anti-vaccination protesters. And so we have these fascinating scenarios where Trudeau is now having to call out the anti-vaxxers. So there's 20% of the 25% of the population that he's not going to get. And so you're really interesting scenario. So I'm going to finish up with what I think might happen over the next couple of weeks.
Perfect. You've got 1 minute. So that's
1 minute. O'Toole really needs about 40% to form the government because they have terrible vote efficiency in the Conservative Party because they win the prairie provinces by massive margins. So he has to win comfortably in Ontario to take most of the seats where most of the population is and steal a few in Quebec to actually form majority government. But he's being squeezed on the right by the People's Party, which have not been discussed much, led by a former Conservative cabinet minister, Maxime Bernier. And they're polling at around 5 or 6% in the polls, and they're almost exclusively an anti-vaccination party. So they may actually play spoiler in this election, where the Conservatives just don't get enough seats to form a majority government, that they're reduced to minority territory, and if they're neck and neck with the Liberals, Justin Trudeau can still be prime minister with about 33% of the vote like he had last time. So it's a fascinating situation ahead. And we'll see how these marketing and branding pivots might change in the last little bit of the campaign, but I'm fascinated to watch the most exciting Canadian election since 2015. The 2019 election was a bore fest. This is actually great. So that's my take.